Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Blue Den Impress's session on memoirs. We're going to go behind the memoir today, and I have two very interesting speakers, authors who have published their own memoirs in the last couple of years, Linda Hutsell-Manning and Sharon A. Crawford. We're just going to wait a minute or two till everyone gets on board, and then we'll get going. So thank you for visiting us today. I'll give you a few housekeeping tips while we're waiting. If you get stalled on the page at some point, just refresh your page and you should be able to catch us back on again. This is a live recording, so there'll be watts and all that going on. At the same time, we will record this and have it for replay on the Facebook page of Blue Den Impress. After the session is over. We will also be making a YouTube video of this to be posted on the authors' websites going forward. So you're not going to miss us, but we would like you to participate in the live recording because you get the chance to ask us questions, and hopefully we got the answers for you. I think we'll get started now. It's about 3 minutes past the hour. I hope you're able to see us now. And so my name is Shane Joseph. I'm the publisher at Blue Den Impress, and I'm very pleased to have our two authors who released their memoirs in the last 2 years, as I mentioned, with us tonight to talk about their personal experiences in writing a memoir. It's not an easy thing. I've tried it myself, and it's a tough job. Fiction is easier, I think. So they're going to tell us all the tricks and tips about how to write memoirs. And in particular, they're going to focus on 4 areas. One is the theme and focus of a memoir. And the second would be, how do you get started? What research do you need in order to write a memoir? And then after you've done that research, the actual writing of it, getting down to the hard work of writing a memoir. And then the dilemma that most memoir writers face is, how do you tell other people's stories? Because you can't only tell your story. There's so many people who touch your lives when you're telling the story, and you're going to have to tell their stories as well, bits of their stories as well. And how do they take to that? And how do they respond to that? And how do you deal with that? Do you have the right to tell their story? So they're going to deal with these 4 sections. Each speaker will speak for about 10 minutes. And then we will open it up to a discussion, because I'll have some questions for them. And then we'll leave time at the end for questions from you, the audience. And if you do have questions, please leave them in the comment section of the Facebook post at the bottom there. And I will scroll through them, and I'll be happy to relay them to the author and or the authors, and they can respond to you in this session itself. So with that, I'm going to introduce you to our 2 speakers. First of all, let me show you the 2 books that they published. These are the 2 books. The Enemy is Within Us by Sharon A. Crawford and Fearless and Determined by Linda Hutsell-Manning. And these books are available wherever good books are sold, in local bookstores. You can order them there. You can order them through online bookstores like Amazon and Indigo and so on. And they're also available as ebooks, both in the Kindle format and in the Kobo format. So the books are not difficult to get at. They're available, as I said, wherever good books are sold. So with that, let me introduce you to our first speaker, who's going to be Sharon A. Crawford. Sharon A. Crawford is a former journalist, writes the Beyond Mystery series, and hosts Crime Beat Confidential on thatchannel.com. She teaches fiction and memoir writing, belongs to Crime Writers of Canada, Sisters in Crime, the Toronto Heliconian Club, and runs the East End Writers Group. You can visit her website at www.samcraw.com. So with that, Sharon, where are you?
I'm here. I'm not hiding behind my book. Thank you, Shane. And yes, as Shane said, we're going to talk about getting this memoir off the ground and how we did that and some of the pitfalls you can run into, but there's a lot of possibilities, as the title tells us. Now, What I like to do is I like to narrow down the focus. I use the no journalist trick here. I use the who, what, when, where, why, the 4 W's and the 1 H, how. So first of all, before you write a memoir, and I found teaching my students, they had a lot of ideas. Some of them knew exactly what they wanted to do, but some, they couldn't make up their mind what exactly to do. So you have to focus. And one way to do that is figure out, why do you want to write a memoir? Do you want to get something off your chest? Did something happen in your past you want to mention? And this sort of segues into what you want to write about. Did you overcome a drug habit as a teenager? Did you suffer a lot from mental illness? Did you have kind of a wacky family that was a little bit off the walls? Did you travel a lot growing up, or have you traveled a lot as an adult? Remembering that a memoir is not your whole life story. It's only a bit of it. The whole life story is an autobiography. So in other words, you could probably write many memoirs if you wanted to, but you have to focus on it. So you also have to figure out what was happening at the time in the world. Unless you were stranded on an island, there were things going on in the world during the time you're going to write about. So make sure you get that into your memoir as well. When did this happen? If it was, sure, maybe when you were a teenager, but when were you a teenager? Were you a teenager 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 30 years ago? I'm not going to tell you how many years ago for me, but you have to stick to that area. You can't go, like I say, you can't go through your whole life. You stick to that area where what you're focusing on, what your theme is. And then you have to figure out who is involved. Now, a family memoir, of course, you'll be in there. You have brothers and sisters. If you have parents, there might be cousins, aunts, and uncles. Who would not go in? Probably an eccentric neighbor across the street who was just really wasn't involved in your life, but you just thought he was funny. Now, I had an eccentric neighbor in my life, lived next door, but there was he got kicked out of the house because he just smoked his cigars. His wife kicked him out. There's a connection to my dad. My dad got cancer. That's mainly what my book is about. My dad had cancer when I was 10. He got cancer and so on until he died. And so that was important, that part about him, because my dad was a smoker and that's where he got his cancer. So how are you going to tell your story? Are you going to just go misery all the way through? Readers will read so much of that, but they don't want to have all misery. They want an upbeat ending or some kind of a resolution or some kind of light at the end of that tunnel. But the other thing you can do is you can use humor. Now, I used humor, not with my dad's cancer, but with some of the things going on when I was at school. And I used more of the self-effacing kind of humor, but I didn't even realize I was doing it until I got into it. So one way you can narrow it down is to write a short summary of what your memoir is going to be about. And I really wish I would have done it because it took me 18 years to finish it. No, I wasn't just writing it, but maybe I wouldn't have had as good a one as if I had published it before. But anyway, I'm going to read just a very brief thing, part of the summary on the back, which is a summary of actually what the book is about. Sharon A. Crawford's memoir is a powerful, sometimes humorous account of a young girl's lessons learned from difficult teachers, bullying, betrayal, and cancer. And that about says really what the book is about. So let's move on to the next thing, which is research. Being an old journalist or former journalist, I tend to suffer from researchitis. You overdo it, but that's okay. It's just how much you don't put it all in, rather to have too much than too little. And there are a lot of places you can research. I'm only going to cover a few of them. And some of the places will depend on what you're writing about. For example, a drug addiction, you would probably go into medical areas about that. Whereas with mine, yes, some medical with the cancer, but photographs are one of the best resources, especially if you're doing family and something with your friends. Looking at the picture can bring back so many memories. Interview the people that you grew up with, your relatives, your friends, if you can. Take notes or record it, whatever way you want to make sure you get it right. Go to the scenes of the crime, if possible, where you grew up or whatever, is part of the scenes of the crime. I don't necessarily mean a murder crime, but you know what I mean, where you grew up and where you lived, where you just went. What was important with me, what Union Station was important to me. So I went back there because my dad worked for the CNR Railway as a timekeeper, and that figures into my story. The other things are newspapers and magazines. And a lot of them are online now. There's the Toronto Star, Globe and Mail, to the library. If you have a library card, you can go in, or you can go into your library account as long as you have a library card, and look up different things from the paper there. You can find information there. I sure did. Although I had to do some of it when I started doing the research, I had to go into the reference library because it wasn't available online. But while there, I also found some other newspapers to look at in print. For example, I wanted, because of Detroit, I wanted something about the situation, Black Day in July. Remember the Gordon Lightfoot song? Because I was there a couple of years afterwards. No Detroit paper, but a Windsor paper started me off there. So newspapers can be helpful. The other thing that is government archives, depending on what you're looking for, which ones you go. With me, it was Toronto, Ontario, and then Ottawa could also be a help too. But the biggest one for me was the Ontario Archives, because I got information about the Canadian National Railways, when it changed, some of the things that happened, when it changed, the type of trains, where it went. That was very important for me, because there was a rail liner, for example, in the early 60s, and I didn't even remember my dad being on it. Well, when we went to visit our relatives, well, obviously he was, so, it was helpful. Other things, reference books that you can read are books that tell the story of what you're looking for. Like with me, it was the railway. I got a book out about the history of the Canadian National Railway. And I also got a book about this ferry that used to ferry people across the Detroit River from Windsor. They get from Windsor to Detroit. And you didn't just go on the ferry like going over to Toronto Island. The whole train coach went on the ferry. So I wanted to find out more about that ferry. And the service, by the way, finished, it was gone the year after, so I was lucky. So publish memoirs, not because you want to copy what other people have written, but you want to see what's written before. How do people handle them? There's many different ways you can approach a memoir. So read other people's memoirs. Now, you want to create an outline. When you're getting started, we're now going to get into getting started ready. Presumably you've done all your research. You will have to do more. You won't get everything the first go around with your research, but create an outline. And some people sort of groan over that, but just remember, it's not sealed in granite. It's flexible. You may change it 10 times. I changed the focus of my memoir, I don't know how many times before it got done finally to be published. So don't worry about it. It's just to get you going. And what I have my students do is, and it's a good idea to do it, is start to write what could be a beginning for your memoir. Once you have an idea of what you want to write about, start to write a beginning. And often that triggers what you can put in the outline. Now, when you're actually writing, all of a sudden you find something, oh, I don't know, I need to look this up. Do not go over and talk to Mr. Google while you're doing that. Because you know why? When you come back, guess what? You will have lost your train of thought. You will not be able to continue going, because your left brain is your brain that you visit Mr. Google with for your, just to find out things, it's your logical brain. Your creative one is your right brain, and the two don't like working together. So try and keep them separate. If there is something there that you really need to look up research on, just put research in the comment section or in red. And when you finish for the day, you can go back and you can make a list of what you have to look up. And you do have a research list, don't you? You better. And another one that you have to do is, when you're writing, is watch your use of the to be verb. That can get really out of whack, and you're not really, especially if you're just writing along. Excuse me. I would suggest if you just wait until you actually are going back to rewrite. And I don't know if you'll write a few chapters and then go back. It depends. Do the find in your word. Do find, and just see how many was's and how many were's and how many is's you have. Make sure you're sitting down when you do that, though. You might be a little appalled about that. So one other thing with research, and then I'll go on to the last heading, is this history that you've been researching. With me, it was the Canadian National Railway. First version of the memoir it was like a history lesson. And of course, everybody reading it, the critiques in the class I was in, they said, no, you've got too much history. You tell the history with your story. So I tell the story of going with my mom and dad to Union Station to get the train, and all the things that would happen with the train, getting on a train, changing train, seeing the big steam engine train coming and having it scare me, things like that. as we're traveling. You put yourself in the story and work the backstory with the history of doing that. And so let us now move on to dialogue. Oh yes, dialogue. What am I saying? You're not going to get it all right. You won't remember exactly. You will remember things that were really important in your life. Some of these things will stick out. For example, my parents didn't tell me my dad had cancer the first time when he had first operation. They said he had TB. 6 months later, my best friend, a bully, said, "Your dad has cancer." So, I mean, that really was an eye opener, and it sort of switched my relationship with my dad, had a big effect on it. So some things, don't worry about, the dialogue getting exact. Now, the dilemma of telling real people's stories. There's a couple of parts for this. Do you use, but everybody seems to run into this. Do you use pseudonyms? Do you use people's real names? What do you do with them? And with the first version, I was using real names, and there was one relative who was kind of not really in her life, and then we discovered he was there. And so of course we cousins were talking about him. And one of the cousins who actually wasn't there, when I next saw her, she said, "I hear you're writing a memoir. I don't want you writing about so-and-so. I don't want my kids reading that." And of course I was angry at her. I said, well, if it gets published, you're going to sue me. No, but I'll be very angry. And at the time, it really bothered me. But I did switch. At that point, I also was switching how I was writing a memoir, what it was focusing on. And, I left this character out, this particular relative, because he really wasn't relevant to what I was writing anyway. So I kind of thanked my cousin for giving me a little warning about that. And so the other thing is telling people's stories with that you have to concern yourself with. What do you do about the name thing? So what did I decide to do? I decided to use pseudonyms, first names only, except for my mother, my father, myself, and my grandpa Charlie, who I was close to. And that's the way I did it. But I used real streets, real places, and real time. So you can do that. I mean, Barbara Emile doesn't, but Anne Murray didn't, but she went around and asked, everybody, if everything was okay that she had written. So everybody has a different way of going about it, and you have to figure it out for yourself, really. Now, the other thing, and I do have a disclaimer at the beginning of the book, which you need to do if you do not use pseudonyms, to protect the innocent, the guilty, and everybody else. Most names have been changed, and then I tell whose names I haven't. The only other thing is the political correctness. Now, I'm sure this is going to come up in the Q&A, so I'm not going to mention too much about it. I had a few things in my book, where there was some racism, or could have been racism and sexism. And as far as the situation in Detroit, I tried to be, I was sort of shocked with some as a little girl, but I tried to be an observer with it. I didn't really take sides. And the only real discrimination I ran into was in grade 5 when one of the girls called one of the boys who was German a Nazi and got hauled up in front of the class with a teacher to apologize. And that was really the one I came across with. And I'm going to end with a quote from Dario Soares, who's a Cuban-American novelist who was interviewed last year with the Bostonian Bostonian magazine and from the Boston University alumni. And I'm not going to go into all his, you can read it online if you want to go back and check on it. But what he's talking about, and he does specify fiction and nonfiction, if you wanted to, the way how you handle writing other people's stories. The point that's being made is that if you are going to write outside of your own culture or from a position of privilege, that you don't do so thoughtfully, that you engage with people in those communities, that you have them read your work and give you feedback. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Sharon. That's very good. Very technical. You've covered all the 4 points that I had listed. With that, I'm going to turn it over now to Linda. But before I do that, I just want to ask our viewers and listeners online. I know that there's many of you out there, and I'm starting to see some questions come in. Thank you, Bob, for that question. We will certainly ask that of the authors. But if there are others who would like to ask questions, this is your chance. Just type them into the comments section of the Facebook feed, and I will relate over to the authors when we get into the Q&A. But before that, I'm going to now turn it over to Linda Hutsell-Manning, who has a slightly different take on memoir writing than Sharon had. It's always good to have different perspectives. So before I turn it over, I just want to introduce Linda. Linda Hutsell-Manning has 11 published children's books, poetry, short fiction in literary magazines, and a novel, That Summer in Franklin. Her two-act comedy, A Certain Singing Teacher, premiered in 2017. For more details, you can visit her website at www.lindahutsellmanning.ca. So with that, Linda, can you step up, please?
Thank you. Hello, everybody, and it's nice to be here and talking about my journey writing this memoir. I guess I was really lucky because when I went back and figured out how long I spent working on it, from the very beginning to the publication was 3 years. Certainly much shorter than any of my other books. Fiction books I've spent 10, 15 years working. So the theme and focus, it was very defined because I wanted to write a memoir about the 2 years teaching in this one-room school, SS number 2 Hamilton Township between Coburg and Port Hope. And so I had this nice little capsule of time, and I wanted to dwell on the physical building and the difficulties that we had to deal with there, how primitive it all was, and all the work I had to do. And I had this wonderful scrapbook. I have it here. It just looks like a very boring old scrapbook, but inside I discovered the scrapbook, and that was one of the main reasons I felt I had the courage to start writing this memoir. It was like a homemade yearbook. And at the beginning, there are profiles of each one of the students the first year, and then every event that we did as the year progressed. So I could use this as a set of markers to go through the first year, which was just wonderful. And I think when I started, I had no idea even if I had enough information to create a memoir that was publishable, but I just thought I would start writing and see where it went. And I did not create an outline. I just started writing. I used the scrapbook, and then I also interviewed a number of my students, in the end, almost 20 of my students. And it started with one student who contacted me on Facebook, which was just a fluke. And it was just when I was starting to think about writing this. So she was able to give me the names of a number of my other students. And since I had the names and all the students in this scrapbook, it was great. And so I ended up mostly, some of the interviews were live and some of them were people wrote to me information. And it was extremely helpful. The other thing that really helped me was a Coburg site called Coburg Yesteryears, which talks about people go on that site and post pictures and things that happened in days gone by, not just in Coburg itself, but in the whole area. So whenever I got stuck when I was writing and couldn't remember something, I would go on to Coburg Yesteryears, and I got wonderful, helpful information from that site. I also just asked everybody. I remember we went back to the actual location of the school, and it doesn't look anything like it did when it was there, and the building is no longer there. And 2 doors from where it was is a garage. And so I went into the garage and sort of asked the guys that were standing around, did anybody know anything about the one-room school? And I ended up getting some good information. You know, they certainly weren't expecting me to ask that. They were thinking I came in to do something with my car, but anyway. So it was great. That was really good. And I found that anywhere I went where I saw somebody that I thought might be the right age or might know somebody, I just kept asking questions, and it was extremely helpful. So when I started to write, I was sort of goaded into it in a way, because I was thinking about writing this memoir, but I wasn't being too serious about it. I found the scrapbook and I was going through that, and it was wonderful, all the memories. And we have a writers group, Spirit of the Hills writers group, and we have monthly meetings. They're now on Zoom, but at this point they were live. And so I mentioned in the meeting that I was thinking of writing this memoir about teaching in the one-room school. And the following week, one of the members contacted me and said that she and another member, who both had published memoirs, were going to be doing a reading at this little venue in Coburg called The Loft. And they would like me to join them and talk about my memoir when I hadn't written anything. So I got to work and I wrote the first chapter. And as Sharon said, when you decide where to start, well, I knew where I was going to start with this interview, but my interview was extremely unorthodox. Although when I've talked to other people that taught in one-room schools, their interviews were, some of them were not unlike mine, which was not like a regular interview going to get a job where they ask you questions about how you're going to deal with this and that, or what you're going to do, or no, it was a completely different, completely different interview that didn't last very long. And I was sure I didn't get the job afterwards, but I did. Anyway, so once I had that first chapter written, then I just kept going through the scrapbook and following the different events in the school. And I could remember, I guess that's one of the things, I'm sure Sharon finds that too, from writing fiction, is that you can, when you start to think about something, then you can almost see it. It's like a scene comes into your mind and you can remember what you were doing or what it was like, and how people were behaving. And so the scrapbook was just wonderful to have and so helpful. So I got through the first year. Then of course I had to deal with the second year. And I knew that I'd done a number of fairly unusual things, creative things, I guess, in the second year. And so I think probably maybe at that point, I made a short outline about the different progression through the second year, but the second year doesn't detail month by month the way the first year does. It's more episodic, although I do follow the school year because that makes a lot of sense. And the summer between the two years, I hardly talk about that at all, because that's not, you know, as Sharon said, you need to focus on what you're going to talk about or what is important. And that was not really important. So I didn't deal with it. I had a young son. He was 1 when I started teaching, and I do bring him into this situation a few times, but not, I don't, and my husband was away, and I was staying with my mother-in-law. And anyway, the whole situation was somewhat unusual. And I focused on the teaching. The teaching, I had a huge amount of research that I had to do for teaching, going through all the textbooks and making up questions and creating outlines. And there was no resources in this school, absolutely nothing. So I was completely on my own. So it was a good thing I was creative and fearless. That's where the title came from, that I jumped into this thing. I had applied for a couple of other teaching jobs, but I had gone to teachers college and then not taught for 2 years, went off with my husband when he was traveling around Canada, and then decided I better get myself together and teach. And so when I went for interviews at town schools, they did not take kindly to this information. And they didn't hire me because they said I was too out of touch with everything. But it was completely different with the one-room school. So it was harder the first year. I mean, it was much harder than teaching in a regular school, but I learned an enormous amount. I'm not particularly good in math. I'm dyslexic. And so math was always a bad subject for me. And I also told the children right at the beginning that I was dyslexic and that I would make spelling mistakes, and that they should come and tell me if I made a spelling mistake on the board. And only a couple of times did anybody have the courage to do that. But I was just upfront about it. But with the math, I learned all my math in those 2 years. I learned a lot more about math teaching it than I certainly did when I was trying to learn as a child and as a high school student. So when I got to the end of writing the first draft, I went back, and I think I was, when Sharon made that comment about don't stop what you're doing and go off and do research because you'll forget where you are. I think that's, I waited a lot of it. I waited until I got through the first draft. There's so many things that you need to know. I needed to know a lot about weather because my children all walked to school, and there were certain situations that happened that were weather dependent. And so I needed, you can find all this information online. It's quite wonderful. And then political events, not very many of them affected us, but certainly the assassination of Kennedy, which happened in that first year in 1962 in November. And I had to go back and read all about it because, of course, I had completely forgotten other than the very bare bones of it. So it is really good to research these things and find out exactly so you get it right. And then something that I didn't get right, four of my girls put on a Beatles concert, and it was quite wonderful. I talk about it a whole chapter with pictures. And so I remembered so many Beatles tunes. And one of the reasons I did was because every noon hour, these girls would come in to help me mark books, and they would turn on the radio and listen to the Beatles. And so I guess the Beatles sort of were imprinted into my mind, but then you get mixed up, like when certain songs were written. And so when I gave I had people read the book that we're going to read the manuscript that we're going to make nice positive comments about it to go on the back, on the inside. And two of them politely told me that 3 of the songs I had the girls singing hadn't been written. And so then I had to scramble around and go back and find the ones that were written, because they put the concert on in the spring of 1964. And of course, I Want to Hold Your Hand was one of the first songs. It was okay, but there were 3 other songs that I really liked that had not been written when they put the concert on. So I had to create other songs. I had to look up and put in other songs, and we had it already in print, didn't we, Shane? With Shane, the publisher, he already had it in the format. And so not only did I have to find songs with different titles, but they had to have the same number of words so that they would fit into the format, because it had already been formatted, and there wasn't very much leeway of changing. You couldn't have a title with 8 words if the other title that was wrong was 3 words. So that was an interesting challenge, but I managed it. And the whole business of telling a real story or using people's names, my publisher told me right at the get-go that I needed to get release forms. And so finding a proper release form to give to there's hundreds of release forms online, but a lot of them have to do with music, and most of them are not applicable to writing. And so I had to do a lot of research to find a decent release form that I could then modify. And so then I started sending them out to all these students whose names I had used. Now, I did not, when you said about Anne Murray, I didn't give any of my students the parts I wrote where I put words in their mouths, lots of dialogue. I didn't ask them to read that and say, is it okay that I've said you said this? And nobody has complained, and nobody has questioned it. As actually several of my students said it was amazing that I could remember things they said, but I didn't really. I just made it up. So I didn't have, and there were two different people in the memoir that I changed the names because the information about them was in both cases, I guess, you would say it was rather sensitive information. And so we didn't want to get into trouble with anyone. So we just changed the names. And again, none of my students that read the novel so far, or I keep calling it a novel. I've written too many novels. The memoir have complained to me or said, why did you change the name of this person? So I guess they went along with it or thought it was okay. I don't know, but that's just fine. So I don't know that there's any. I don't think there's any much else that I need to say. It was a wonderful experience writing this. And when I finished, I still didn't have any idea if anybody would find it interesting. And people have found it interesting, partly, I guess, because it's talking about an era that's gone. And it's so different. Teaching now is so in a graded school is so different from a one-room school. And there are a lot of people around who either went to a one-room school or taught in a one-room school. And so there is definitely a market for this book, which is comforting. It is sold better than my novels, but there you are. And so I am actually going to write another memoir, but I'm just getting started at it from a different period in my life. And I don't think there's anything else I need to say, really. I really enjoyed writing this. It was fun. It was interesting and exciting to sort of go back there and remember things. And I do say at the beginning, which the same thing as Sharon said, you put in a comment at the beginning and that, that it is your memory. And so it could be faulty, and that there will probably be things that you remember that other people say didn't happen. I also found out when I interviewed my students that there were things they told me that I didn't know happened. So I was able to include some things that I had no idea about. Not necessarily bad things, but interesting things that went on outside, because I was never outside. So different from these days. I was never outside before class, recess, noon hour. They were on their own, and there was never any terrible incidents that happened, except the boys smoking in the shed, which put me into a funk. But other than that, things went along pretty smoothly, I think. Okay, so I think that's it for me. Thank you.
Okay, Sharon. Sorry, Linda. Thank you very much. That was quite interesting. It was different from the version that Sharon gave us, because it seemed like you wrote the book and then researched things as you went. And both, as you see, both authors have used different approaches to gathering the material for their books. Now we have a lot of questions that have piled up, and I'm in a situation here where we have 20 minutes to go. I had some questions to ask. So I'm going to keep my questions to one question, which is a very fundamental question, and then I'm going to get to the questions that the audience have asked us. So the question I have, and I'm going to ask each of you to explain this one to me. It's one thing to write a personal story that happened to you, but when you try to then sell that story to a general public, you always face the question, so what does it matter to them? Where is the universal theme that they can latch onto in order to read the book? So how did you introduce a universal theme in your memoir? Or did you feel that the theme that you were writing was universal enough? So I'll start with Sharon. If you can come by, Sharon, and let us know what you thought about it.
I think a little bit of both. Like the period I grew up in, because I was an only child of elderly parents, that sort of set things up for for a slightly different story, especially in a time when most families had more than one child. I think I could count on one hand and have a finger or two left over the number of my friends who were only children, but like myself. So that was that. But you actually, you Shane, you caught something that I was writing about in there, was about my dad's cancer. And so I focused a bit more on that in one of the rewrites, or several of the rewrites. And I guess the cancer is a universal thing, because sure, people got cancer in the 50s and the 60s, but the treatment was, I think, was burn or cut, I believe, or cut or burn was the slang used at that time for it. And there's a lot of research that has been done, but it's still, people still get it. And it runs in, if it's in families and it's a child that gets it, or a parent, it really is upsetting. And I think people can relate to that.
Okay, and Linda, how did you, what was your universal theme here?
I certainly didn't think about it when I was writing, but I guess when I finished and when I started talking to people about it, it was the huge difference between the two systems, the way it was and the way it is. And there's so many ramifications and details about those differences. And so I'd say that's what was my universal theme, if there was one. I don't know.
I know, and I tend to agree, because when I got your book and I talked to a few people about it, the feeling I got was that most people who were of my vintage, I guess, had been to a one-room school if they had been out in the country. And so, you know, it was a common experience in Canada to have gone to a one-room school. And that was, I guess, the universal theme. That's what I kept bumping into. So I thought it was a very interesting thing to do. Okay, so I'm going to go now to questions from the audience, and they seem to be piling up. I don't know whether we can answer all of them in the time we have. We'll try to get to all of them if we can. If not, we will type in the answers in the comments section against those particular questions. I've already started doing one or two, but we'll get to all of them. But here's an interesting one, and either of you can answer, or both of you can answer this. Can the author be sued by someone who doesn't want to be in the book, even if pseudonyms are used?
Well, I would say not if pseudonyms are used, but yes, if pseudonyms are not used. And that was, that was certainly in my mind with one of my characters. So that would be my answer.
And Sharon, what do you think?
Well, I use pseudonyms except for my parents and myself and my grandfather first name. Certainly, as like Linda said, if pseudonyms, no. Otherwise, it's a bit dicey, really, because it's just the libel thing. You know, did it actually happen? Or is it true? And my answer would be to consult a lawyer who knows what they're talking about. I wouldn't want to give a person an answer yes or no for that, because I'm not a lawyer.
Yeah, that's a good answer, because my sense is that that it's a slippery slope. Even pseudonyms, if they point very directly to somebody and that person could be identified, even though you have a different name, it could lead to a lawsuit. The only challenge then is that the onus is on the person suing you to prove that it was in fact true, or that it wasn't true. So it's a bit of a minefield, and I agree with you. Talking to lawyers is probably a good thing to do. So the next question, and this is more for Linda. People seem to be interested in your scrapbook. So the question was this a scrapbook that you created as you were teaching in order to keep track of your students? And when and why did you create it?
No, I don't remember. I must have started to create it in the spring, like near the end of the year. However, like there's things that I don't remember. There's pictures of all my students, black and white pictures. And then, so I obviously, when I decided we were going to do this yearbook, I thought it would be good for each of the students to make a series of statements. And it's very obvious when you start reading these that I had set up a series of questions. You know, what is your name? What grade are you in? What subjects do you like? What do you like to do at recess? What's the best thing that happened to you? this person said the best thing that happened to me this year was I fell down and put a hole in my knee. She was in grade 1. Anyway, so they were charming and interesting. And then I didn't actually do most of the writing of this. The students did it. I guess I must have asked people if they would be interested in writing up. So like the first, I don't know, the open house was the first. We had open house, which was a terrifying thing for me, but I got through it and it was okay. I have an index, and then, oh, the Halloween party was the first thing. And somebody has written, one of my students has written up what the Halloween party was like, one of the more senior students, and it just works its way through. So I'm not even sure whether I did it as we went along or whether I must have, because I don't think everybody would remember that much. So when the Halloween party was over, probably the next week, I asked if somebody would like to write up something, or maybe I asked 3 or 4 people to write it, and then I picked one of them. I don't know, because I don't remember. But it ended up being this wonderful compilation of everything that went on. All these different episodes are written by different students. And the first year we went to Old Fort Henry and the Thousand Islands, which was a huge thing. And that's all written up. And then we also adopted a baby starling. And there's the story of Rebel, the baby starling. And it's a diary. Some of it's written by me, but most of it's written by one of the students that took on looking after this starling on the weekend. And it's quite lovely. We had some very interesting episodes with this starling in this classroom, especially when it started flying around. But the scrapbook, yeah, I just created it as I went along. I think I must have.
Okay, all right, we'll take that as your answer. I've got one for Sharon here. Sharon, did you have any research frustrations, information you wanted to find and couldn't? And if so, how did you deal with them?
I don't think I really did have any trouble at all, because being an old journalist, I kind of knew where to look, I guess. So I knew I had to interview my relatives, and I took notes. And my relatives just passed me along to other relatives I had forgotten about to get more information. And then I'd used one trick of the trade is you go to the library, you ask the librarian for information. They have all the answers, and they know, at least they will know where to send you what you can look for. So I don't remember having any problems with any of that. More the problem was, was the run-in with the cousin, and then but the lesson that taught me, and all the different revisions I had to do before I finally got the story right, more so than the actual research.
Okay. And here's the more interest in probably Linda's release form. What were the basics of your release form? What did you put into it?
Wow, I should have grabbed a copy of it. It said I so and so, and then you had to put your name, allow the information, allow my name to be used, and I will not. There was a statement about saying there would be no comeback, that there was no comeback, that they could do anything about the information that I wrote, that I said about them, that it was all right for me to just say whatever I wanted. And as I said, it was really very generous of nobody. Nobody demanded to look at the parts that were written about them, but it was all the way through. Everybody was in it all the way through, and people were off and on being talked about. So they would have had to read the whole manuscript. I did have one student who read the manuscript very early on, and she gave me some very helpful information. Yeah, that would be my answer, I think.
Okay. All right. So I have a question for you. I've been patiently waiting to ask, hoping I had some time, but I do. So in today's world, in Canada, we're a very diverse country, and we have mixed race subjects. We have children who are perhaps half Irish and half Italian, or half something else and half something else. And they're born in Canada, and they're going to be writing a story about their respective ancestors. And one could always pop up against this question of, okay, so what gives you, dear Canadian offspring of immigrants, the right to write about Irish people or Italian people or Jamaicans or Sri Lankans or Russians or wherever your parents happen to come from? How do you deal with that?
Do you mean if somebody calls you to the floor on it, or what?
Yes. I'm saying, somebody would say, what gives you the authority to write about an ethnic group, even though maybe a parent of yours may be from that group, but came to Canada, many years ago, and then you were born. So you're basically Canadian, born here. What gives you the right to write about the homeland of your parents when you don't know those people? You don't speak maybe the language even sometimes. So how do you deal with that?
Well, I might have to quote Darius again, but I think you have to do it very carefully and very thoughtfully, because they're your ancestors and you're, say, part Irish and part Italian or whatever the mixture is. In my case, it's German and French. You would do like I did. You would talk to these relatives. You would find out about the ancestors. You would do your research to make sure you got it right. And if you didn't know, you would ask. And I guess you wouldn't pretend to be an authority. I mean, you do it with respect. I think you have to do it with respect. And it depends on what your memoir is focusing on, how much you're going to need to put in there. Are you doing a family history from going way back when? Or is it your story like mine was? So some of the family would come in because they were part of the story when I was living. And maybe you would go back a little bit with the ancestry. So it depends, I think, on what you're writing, but I think you do it very carefully and very respectfully.
So I guess if you keep the focus on yourself, because it is your perceptions of what happened to you and of how you perceive these different groups, you probably have an out in terms of, this is how I saw the world, and this is what happened to me. And I don't claim to be an authority of these various groups, but I'm telling you that having come from those backgrounds, this is how I saw the world. And if you, I guess, stick to that keep the focus on yourself, because it's after all a memoir, you might be able to get through that kind of difficult situation. It's very sensitive. I agree. It's very difficult. And we are seeing more of that, right? Because as we blend and get more diverse as a country, we're going to have more mixed community children or stories that we're going to have to figure out how to deliver. So that's that one. And then the other thing, I had a question. I think I still have 6 minutes more. The memoir is, well, let's go to fiction, because that's my favorite playing ground. Fiction is an exercise in imagination, right? So we can lie to tell a higher truth. We can make up things. In memoir, you really can't make up things. Okay, you can. All right, Linda, go for it. Tell me, what can you make up?
I made enormous amounts of dialogue. I remembered I had one student who was a real smart aleck. And so I gave him a situation where he had to, he could have refused to do what I asked him to do. It was playing a game called Pin the Tail on the Donkey, and they'd never played it and they didn't know what it was. And so when I explained it, and so this student, I asked him if he would go first, because you can make a fool of yourself being blindfolded and wandering around trying to put a tail on a donkey, and you're not even in the right area and you end up putting it on the nose or whatever. And I kind of figured that he could take it, like he was a real smart aleck, but he did brilliantly. So I just made it all up. And another thing, when you made a comment about not finding research. One of my young grade 1 students was hit by a car on the way home quite badly in the winter. And I had very little memory of this. And I made the whole scene up. Some of my students, a couple of my students told me things that I did, like I took my coat and outside and went without a coat and put my coat over this child on the ground. I don't remember this, but you know, being a good fiction writer helps. you just make it up. And I was looking at, I've got quotes here that about writing memoirs, I guess, or about memory. There are some things one remembers, even though they may never have happened. Harold Pinter said that. And you don't remember what happened. What you remember becomes what happened. So you see, lots of people have dealt with this situation and gotten around it. And so I think some of those quotes were to do with fiction, but even in fiction, you know, in my novel, That Summer in Franklin, there's a situation that happens, and I had several, which I totally made up. It did not happen. And I had 2 different people come to me at one of my readings, and, you know, nudge, nudge, wink, wink. I remember that. Yeah, I remember when that happened. Oh, did you? So there's an incredible manipulation in memory, not only of what you remember, but of how other people are affected by what you say you remember. So there's no defined lines.
Well, that's a good way of looking at it. I have to admit that, yeah, dialogue in most memoirs tend to be made up because you can't remember the exact speech word for word, so that's made up. And as you say, when you use pseudonyms to try and disguise certain characters, then you're making up again. So there is an element of fiction that creeps into the memoir, whether you like it or not. And I would like to draw our readers to a couple of books that we were talking about earlier before we got on this session. One was called Too Close to the Falls by Catherine Gildener, and the other one was A Million Little Pieces by James Frey. And these were considered to be memoirs, and then they were challenged by various groups to say that they read more like fiction. They were quite controversial books, and as a result, they sold a lot. They are interesting books to read because they led to an inflection point in the memoir where the tendency to embellish came in, and I think the term creative nonfiction, I think, started to evolve from there. So the memoir is evolving. It is it's a very difficult thing to write. I know I've tried it myself, and I'm struggling with it. I prefer fiction, but I say hats off to those who write memoirs because it's a very noble thing to do. You're leaving a trace of your life and the lives of people you've touched behind, and I think it's something that everyone should, at least one memoir in their life, just attempt it, because it's worth doing. So we are on the top of the hour, and I want to thank you all for your questions. We didn't answer all of them, but we will get to them in the comments later on. And I just want to hold these 2 books up again. The Enemy is Within Us by Sharon A. Crawford, and Fearless and Determined by Linda Hutsell-Manning, both published in the last 2 years. Linda's book in 2019 and Sharon's in 2020. They're very bold to come out at a time during pandemics when, you know, books are hard to buy, but books are still easy. They're available, and I would encourage you to buy these books and read them because they tell some very interesting and very courageous stories. And with that, I thank you very much for listening to us today, and we will have more of these sessions. We have another one on the short story coming up in a month from now. I hope you will tune in. And with that, I'm going to wish you all a good night.